story last week. So this is really, for me, part two of what I spoke about last week, changing ourselves. And I spoke a lot about judging last week, and I want to do a little more this week. But then I want to talk about self-nurturing, because if we feel good about ourselves, we tend to judge other people. Oh my, I can't believe this. I'm sorry, Michelle is here. This is probably the first time you've been up before noon in years, huh? Welcome. Sorry. Anyway, when we feel good about ourselves, we tend to judge other people much less. But I wanted to start with a quote a friend of mine put on Facebook this week, and I think it's from Greg Braden. I'm not really 100% sure, but he wrote, "Respect yourself enough to walk away from anything that no longer serves you, grows you, or makes you happy. If you aren't being treated with love and respect, check your price tag. Maybe you marked yourself down. It's you who tells people what your worth is. Get off the clearance rack and get behind the glass where they keep the valuables." So I wanted to start with a story this week that I read on the internet, and it's by a gentleman named Elijah Bonheim, who's got a PhD, and he writes that he was in California by the Pacific Ocean, and it sounds like he was like by Big Sur, by this beautiful place, doing a workshop for 15 women. And they had a big break one day, and so he decided that he'd go for a ride along the beautiful Pacific coast. And he did that, and then he stops off at a restaurant to eat. And he notices there's a big guy standing by the door of the restaurant, by the kitchen. And this guy is staring at him. And he starts to feel really uncomfortable. And to himself, he's saying, "Stop staring at me, stop staring at me." And finally, the guy comes over to him and starts to question him. He said, "Are you a tourist? Are you on vacation? Why are you here?" And this fellow who wrote the article begins to bristle. He's getting really angry that this guy is checking him out, and it's none of his business. And he thinks to himself that the guy's a redneck. And he said that usually what he would do if somebody did that to him is he would close down. But he couldn't close down in this case because before the group broke for lunch, he gave them an exercise that he calls seeing with sacred eyes. And here's the instructions that he left these women with right before they went to lunch. He said, when you go to lunch today, wherever you encounter someone, greet them as God. Inwardly, bow to them and honor them as embodiments of spirit. So he thinks about that, and he looks at this guy, and he thinks, I don't think that's what God would look like. He's got this big fat belly, and he's got hairy hands. So you can see he's not into judgment. And but he does the exercise. So to himself now, he talks to this guy, to himself, and he says, I know God lives within you. You help me, within you. Help me to release my judgments. I know nothing about you. Forgive me for judging you. I bow to you. I honor you. And then outwardly, he chats with this guy, and he tells him that he's doing this workshop for 15 women, and they talk, and then the guy goes back into the kitchen. And the author here finishes his meal, and he gets up, he pays his check, and as he's leaving, this guy comes running out of the kitchen screaming, wait, wait, wait. And he has 3 pies. And he said, I was back there, I baked these pies for your women because I thought they'd enjoy them. And now this guy is totally dumbfounded. And he says, he writes, he said, would he have acted differently if I hadn't honored his presence? Who knows? He said, all I can say for sure is that when we judge people, we don't see the divinity that's within them. And when we open our hearts, we can call forth the best that's in them. And he said, look at this gesture that he did. He gave me a gesture of hospitality, a gesture of kindness, and a gesture of welcome. And who knows whether it would have happened before, but he stepped outside of all those judgments, and instead of seeing a redneck, he saw God. So Alan Cohen has written a book called Why Your Life Sucks. Isn't that a great title? He writes in there about judging, and he said, you know, when you try to fix somebody, they become more and more defiant. I talked about this a little bit last week, that he said nobody wants to be fixed. They want to be loved. They want to be appreciated. Nobody wants to be seen as defective. And when we appreciate people, when we appreciate them for who they are, we set up an environment which they can grow in. And Joe, every time I looked at what I'm about to talk about, I thought about Joe Lombardi, because in our book group, I don't know how many times I've heard him say something just like this. If you're upset because somebody has a problem that's theirs, it's your problem. I'm sorry. If you're upset about somebody else's problem, it's your problem. It's not their problem, because you have a charge. You have a charge on an issue because you haven't been healed of that issue. And I got a really perfect example of that the beginning of last week. Most of you know my daughter adopted a 6-year-old girl from India in August. She's now 7. She turned 7. And my daughter called me up last week and she said, I have to ask you a question. And I said, what? And she said, when I was a little girl, did you guys punish me a lot if I didn't eat my food? And I said, I don't remember. And she said, it's really important to me. Let's talk about it and think about it. Would you do that? And I said, yeah. And so I said, you know, I think we did. I really think we did. My daughter has, well, I'm not going to go into it. She has a story about a time I made her eat a hot dog and she puked that she tells everybody. But I said, you know, I think we really did. I think if you didn't eat your meal, we'd make you sit there for an hour until you either ate it or whatever. You had to go to bed early. And we started to talk, and I said, you know, I have to tell you something. I'm really sorry. I apologize. It was really stupid. Didn't make a damn bit of difference in who you became, did it? And she said, you know, thanks for the apology, but that's not why I called. And I said, why did you call? What's it about? And her new little girl is not a good eater. And my daughter said, you know, I'm not mean to her, but internally it upsets me way more than I know it should upset me because she's not eating well. And I was just reading a book about adoption, and it said if you've got issues with your child, a lot of times those issues are because they're unhealed from your own childhood. And she said, so thanks, Dad. Now I know why I'm having this reaction. And it's really not so much about her as it is about me. And now that we talked about it, maybe I can feel better. So I kind of wasted an apology, but anyway. In the Course in Miracles, it says that before you enter into a situation where you're going to be teaching somebody or doing some healing work, remind yourself, I am here only to be truly helpful. I am here only to be truly helpful. And what does helpful look like in the moment? What does this person need rather than what do I want to give? So what does somebody need rather than what I want to give them? Because when we regard other people as souls rather than as broken toys, they're much more likely to stand up on their own. So I saw this little fun thing this week about a mother who saw her 5-year-old daughter do something that she didn't want the 5-year-old daughter to do. And so she said to her daughter, if I were you, I wouldn't do that. And the little girl said, but you're not me, Mommy. I thought it was funnier than that. All right. So I was reading something by a rabbi this week who wrote, she said that how we relate to God is how we relate to life. That as we take responsibility for our own spiritual growth, we become what she referred to as self-responsible. And that no one path works for everybody. You know, when we judge people like that, we're kind of judging that they're not walking their path the way we would walk their path. But the fact is, it's none of our business, really, that there's not one path for everyone. We're all drawn to a different path because we're all unique. We're all different. And she said God encourages us to forge our own path, you know, through our intuition and through synchronicity, whatever it is. We're not all one. We're unique individuals, and we don't need to imitate anybody, and we don't need anybody to imitate us. What we need to do is to be responsible and act in the uniqueness that each of us is. And when we think like that, we tend not to judge other people. Deepak Chopra said, if you want to reach a state of bliss, make a decision to relinquish the need to control, the need to be approved, and the need to judge. Give up those three and you'll reach a state of bliss. When I was in the School of Ministry one night, one of our instructors went around the room and asked everybody how they first came to religious science or heard of religious science. And every single person in the room pointed to one person except me, because I was an East Coast person. And the person that brought all of them to religious science was a minister named Terry Cole Whitaker. And if you're an East Coast person, you probably never heard of Terry Cole Whitaker. Becky first got into or heard about religious science through Terry Cole Whitaker. She was she had one of the first TV ministries on the West Coast. And later, Becky and I, now we're friends with her, we got to know her really well, but Terry wrote a book. One of her books that she wrote is called What You Think of Me Is None of My Business. What you think of me is none of my business. And in that book, she says, other people aren't our source, that no one else is responsible for your happiness. She said, other people may be the channel or the avenue through which we get some happiness, but they're not responsible for making us happy. They're the only thing that's responsible for making any of us happy is our own higher power. Because we believe that we're here to look for that higher power, and we're not here to look for anybody else as a source for our security or our happiness. And when we get to believe that, when we get to believe that other people are responsible for our happiness or our security, what we do is we try to manipulate them to get from them what we want. And one of the ways of manipulating is to judge. And so we can get people to follow what we want them to follow, rather than maybe the path that they should be following. And she said no one else can really fill us up. And she gave the example of Marilyn Monroe. She said, look at Marilyn Monroe. She was absolutely beautiful. She had a lot of talent, and she didn't believe really in herself. And so she looked to all kinds of other places to fill her up rather than doing it herself. And she wound up dying a very lonely death, you know, of an overdose of pills. And I read this week about another person, another example of this, and I'm going to repeat it now. And it just, for me, it spoke to, it's about Barbara DeAngelis, who wrote a book called Real Moments. And in there, she talks about a time in her life when she felt really judged. And then she got to another place in her life and turned into everything that she didn't want to be, and then came through it again. So I just want to share it with you. So she writes that when she was 12 years old, she wasn't cute and she wasn't blonde. She didn't wear the right clothes because her parents didn't have enough money to get her the right clothes. And she was the only kid in her school whose parents were divorced. and she needed to wear glasses, and she said she had this ugly pair of white glasses that she wore. And so she felt really alone. And every month, her school had a dance that everybody went to. And so she said she went to this dance, and every month, the same thing would happen. The other girls would all get chosen, and she would be standing there, the last girl not chosen. And I think reading this, that all of us could relate to. You don't have to be a girl to relate to being the last one picked on a team or whatever, and feeling that. And she said then what would happen, she would be standing there, the last girl, and then she said an overweight boy named Marvin, whose face was covered with pimples, not pimples, freckles, and his hands were covered with sweat, would come and ask her to dance, and everybody else would snicker and laugh at them, and she would curse herself for being so different. So you see the effects of what it's like to be judged. And then she said, she didn't go into it, but when she got into high school, she became popular. I don't know if she grew into being prettier or what, but she became popular. And she said, and then in high school, I befriended only the other popular kids. And I did to the unpopular kids what was done to me. And she said, I became what I hated so much when I was a social outcast. And then for some reason, when she was a senior, she realized, she lived in Philadelphia, that she needed to leave, that she needed to get out of Philadelphia and be somewhere on her own. And even though she could have gotten into some really good schools and been with some of her friends, she attended a college far away where she knew nobody. She said, I needed to be free from judging and from being judged myself. She said, because when I was at home, my desire to belong was stronger than my desire to be myself. And so she went away, and that's how she found herself in those college years. And she ended this chapter in the book with something I find really touching, and so I want to share it. Remember, the fat kid's name is Marvin. And so she said, so Marvin, wherever you are, forgive me for not seeing that you felt ashamed and rejected as I did. That we were kindred souls back then. I hope, like me, you finally found your dignity. And that whoever your dance partner is now always looks proudly up at you when you take her in your arms. Isn't it beautiful? So, Eckhart Tolle, in one of his books, asked the question, what is spiritual realization? And then he says, Jesus said, deny yourself. And he said what Jesus meant, now we're talking about spiritual realization, what Jesus meant was deny the illusion of yourself, meaning your ego. And he said when we deny that, when we deny the ego, what remains is the light of consciousness. And that is being. That is the deeper, true I. And he said the only thing that ultimately matters, the only thing that ultimately matters in our life is can I sense my essential beingness? Can I sense my essential beingness? The I am in the background of my life all of the time. He said that I am is there all of the time. Can I sense my essential identity as consciousness itself? That's who the real me is. He said, can I do that, or am I losing myself in what happens in life, losing myself in the mind of the world, rather than being who I really am and who I need to be? So I want to wind up today speaking about a book that somebody who comes here recommended to me. Lynn Grace recommended this book, and it's titled Dying to Be Me by Anita Moorjani. And I read this book I'm a pretty fast reader, but I read it in 2 sittings. It was so riveting for me. And what it is, Anita Moorjani is from an Indian family, East Indian, but she grew up in Hong Kong. And she writes about some of the stuff that she went through in her life, because she was always a very independent person. Her families were Hindu. Her family was Hindu, and they kept setting up arranged marriages for her, and she kept saying, no, 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 no. And eventually she meets somebody, falls in love, gets married. And I think 4 years into the marriage, she got cancer. And eventually she went into a coma, and the doctors told her husband, maybe she's got a week. And he wouldn't give up. And she in this coma, it's hard to describe the whole book, but in this coma, she had a near-death experience and learned in that experience what life is all about, the meaning of life, not just for her, she puts it, but for everybody. And so she, at the end of the book, she talks about, people ask her, well, why did you get this cancer? And she said, I know why I got it. I got it out of fear. And she said, what was I afraid of? Just about everything. And she said, you know, most of us are taught fear from such an early age. And she said, let me tell you what I learned in that time. And she had this incredible experience. She said, what I learned when I was in that coma and when I had this near-death experience, I learned that we already are what we spend our entire lives trying to attain. We're already that, and we're out reaching for it. She said, we just don't realize it. And she said, we come into this world, she believes we come into this world knowing it, but as we grow up and we live in the world, it kind of erodes. Not our magnificence erodes, but the idea of our magnificence arose. And she said when she was ill in this coma, she absolutely knew that she was going to survive. And she could actually hear conversations that were taking place in other rooms. In fact, when she came out of the coma, and one of the doctors came in, she addressed him by name, and he said, how do you know me? You've never seen me. She said, oh, I saw you. And she repeated conversations that he had in another room with her husband and the other doctors. And she heard one of the technicians, when they said, oh God, she's not going to make it, she's going to die. She heard that, and she told her brother about it, and her brother went and yelled at the technician for hurting his sister's feelings. But anyway, she said she knew that she was going to survive. She said, because my magnificent self had decided to survive. And she said it wasn't so much, I think this is really important, she said it wasn't so much a shift in her state of mind or her beliefs as it was finally allowing her true spirit to shine through. So she didn't need to change anything. She just needed to be who she really was. And you know, it reminded me, Meister Eckhart says that true spirituality isn't a matter of adding, it's a matter of subtracting. And that's kind of what she was saying. She said, we don't have to, she reached the realization that the only thing that really matters is love in the entire universe. And she said, you know, we don't have to work at being loving. Realizing we are love transcends having to work at it. She said it means knowing there's no separation between you and me. And if I know that I love, I know your love too. And if I can care for myself, I automatically care for you. When we know that we're all love, if I care for me, I automatically care for you. She said all we need to do is simply be love. This is all she heard and all she found out while in a coma. She said, I know the universe is composed of unconditional love, and we're all expressions of that unconditional love. That's all we can be, because it's the nature of the universe. So I want to close with something from Dan Millman that's an afterthought in his book, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. Remember, if you've read that book, there's this character, Socrates, who's like his higher self. And so Millman writes, I'm not special. We all have our Socrates. He's your higher self. So be guided by the best that's in you. In any moment, you can ask, What would my higher self do? And you'll know the right course. Trust yourself. Trust the process that is your life. You are the spiritual being that you've been waiting for. God bless you. Thank you for being here, and wish you all a great week.